What's up, team? Welcome back to Common Man Whiskey. This is another exciting, high energy, very cool intro to a video that you should definitely watch. Welcome back, everyone, to Common Man Whiskey. This is video 2. My goal today, look into the camera. Last time I was looking up here, looking down here. Uncomfortable in front of the camera, we addressed it. I'm looking straight into your soul this time. Thanks for joining. There are tens of you did watch this, so we got momentum. I appreciate it. Today we're gonna do a little bourbon education. So feedback that I got from the first episode is that I threw out a lot of terms, maybe assumptively, thinking that people know the language of whiskey, the language of bourbon. So today I wanted to cover a few of those terms. Today I brought my handy dandy notes so I don't have to look over here. A couple big things. We're talking whiskey. Whiskey is an umbrella term, okay? It covers any of the malted beverages that you hear about. You hear about your Scotch, your Irish, your Jameson, different things like that. All of that is whiskey. Personally, in many cases, is bourbon. Now, it's a square, is a rectangle, is a circle, is a who knows. I didn't pay attention in school. But all bourbon is whiskey. Not all whiskey is bourbon. There are a few requirements, and I brought some handy dandy props. Buffalo Trace, to me, when I think bourbon, this is the purest form, simplest, most basic bourbon you can find. Bourbon has to be a couple of things. First of all, it has to be made in the United States, not Kentucky. A lot of people think Kentucky. Here in Texas, we're offended by that. Has to be made in the United States. The mash, or the grain recipe, has to include at least 51% corn. That's unique to other spirits. Corn is an American grain. It adds a certain sweetness, kind of rich, caramely, vanilla profiles oftentimes, which is unique to your Scotch or your Irish whiskeys or your Japanese whiskeys. It needs to be aged in brand new American charred on the inside, white oak barrels. Some other whiskeys of the world will use ex-bourbon casks, wine casks, barrels that have been used before. In bourbon, it has to be a brand new white oak American barrel. There's also some, we don't want to get too into the weeds here, but there's some rules around proof. It can't enter the bottle at above 160 proof or below 80 proof. It has to enter the still at a certain proof, etc., etc. But there is federal legislation around bourbon. It is the American spirit. So once again, all bourbon is whiskey, not all whiskey is bourbon. Sure hope I said that right the first time. We got an editing job to do. What we'll talk about is whiskey versus whiskey. You say, what's the difference? Well, there's actually 2 different spellings of whiskey that you'll see. In Japan, Scotland, and Canada, they spell whiskey H-I-S-K-Y, no E, if you can see it on this Campbellton malt here. The reason for that is, who knows? You could probably Google it. I don't know. But you'll notice in Ireland and in the United States, whiskey is spelled with an E. So you can see here on the Buffalo Trace, W-H-I-S-K-E-Y. There's nothing different necessarily with the bottle other than that it might be different countries or different styles. It's simply just a different spelling. Next thing we'll talk about is what I call the Big 5 whiskey. Now, it's always growing. When I talk about the Big 5, I'm talking about the 5 countries that are most known for their whiskey production. It's always growing. There's other countries across Europe and Asia that are making great whiskey these days. Typically, when I'm talking about the Big 5, I'm talking about the United States, Canada, Scotland, Ireland, and Japan. Those 5 constitute the Big 5 countries of whiskey, which is where most of the whiskey production in the world is going to come from. The thing I want to talk about as you're getting into whiskey, as you're getting into stores looking for bottles, is a couple common things you might see on a bottle that are going to help you identify what style of whiskey or bourbon is in that bottle. The first and most prominent I already talked about is bourbon. Oftentimes you'll also see something called straight bourbon. The only difference between bourbon and straight bourbon is that straight bourbon needs to have been aged at least 2 years, or it's not straight bourbon, you just have to call it bourbon. The next thing you'll commonly see is single malt. Actually, the newest recognized category of whiskey is the American single malt. I have my Balcones here, Pride of Waco, Texas, Sick'em Bears. This is an American single malt. The difference in that is, as opposed to a corn, wheat, rye, barley mash, a single malt is typically made out of 100% malted barley. It's going to typically be a lot lighter, brighter, potentially more citrus, more sweet type of characteristics, as opposed to a bourbon, which is going to be oaky and rich and dark and sweet, etc. So you'll be seeing a lot more American single malts as we go into 2025 and beyond. Next thing you'll see commonly is a rye whiskey, or even a high rye bourbon. My example here of a rye is actually this beautiful, shout out to the Bourbon Junkies, Dark Arts Whiskey House Bourbon Junkies pick, which is very interesting. This is a straight rye finished in maple syrup barrels with toasted Amburana oak staves. Really highly recommend this one if you can get your hands on it. Rye is just a different grain. You're going to see in high rye bourbons or rye whiskeys a lot more typically spice, peppercorn, arugula, a thinner mouthfeel oftentimes, as opposed to that thick, oily feel that you're looking for in a bourbon or a wheated whiskey, which we'll talk about. And that's kind of what you'll see typically in a rye whiskey. As mentioned, is a wheated bourbon. Here I have, if I could get my act together, the famous Weller, which is the original and most notable wheated bourbon. They have several different wheated bourbons in their line. All that means is it's still bourbon, still 51% corn, still white oak American barrel, made in the United States, but the second highest grain content is going to be wheat, outside of the 51% or more corn. A lot of times you're seeing bourbon mashes be 60, 70+% corn. Wheat just needs to be the next highest grain in order to call that a wheated bourbon. There's also wheat whiskey, which means that corn necessarily may not be the most 51% more grain in the spirit. It could be 51% wheat or even higher in a mix of different grains as well. The next thing we're going to talk about is bottled in bond. Bottled in Bond Act of 1897 essentially sets up bourbon as an American spirit. At the time, there was a lot of funny business going on in the world of whiskey. People were adding color and flavoring and selling it as fine, expensive whiskey, but really it was just junk that may not even have grains in the bottle at all. I've got my favorite, Early Times. You can see I hate this one, about out there. But bottled in bond just simply creates a few laws around the whiskey. First of all, it needs to be distilled at one distillery in the same season. So if you're blending whiskeys from different distilleries, or if you're distilling it over multiple years, it does not follow the Bottled in Bond Act. You can't put it on the label. Bottled in bond also needs to be 100 proof, and like all bourbon, it can have no color, flavor, or any additives, excluded what comes from the grains and the oak barrel. It's true of all bourbon, by the way. It's the only whiskey in the world that allows no additives. Some other whiskeys allow coloring, flavoring, different things like that to be added. Not bourbon, certainly not bottled in bond bourbon. Common things you'll see on a lot of bottles as you're shopping is words like small batch, single barrel, barrel strength, cask strength, foolproof, things along those lines. Sometimes we skip right over those, just assuming either we're embarrassed to ask or we think we should already know, but I'll talk about a few of those things today. The first thing, and probably most commonly, is a small batch. I have my Garrison Brothers here. This is absolutely my favorite distillery right now. This is not sponsored, I just love it. A small batch means that any number of barrels can be combined into that bottle of whiskey to make a small batch. It could be 5 barrels or 100 barrels, or really any number. The distillery or the bottler does not have to disclose. The reason that you would do this is so that you can consistently get the same flavor profile through years and years of different weather and different seasons throughout the aging process, different crops, different things like that. You can kind of get a consistent flavor profile throughout all your releases. The next thing, we're going Garrison Brothers again. This is actually a Fredericksburg 2020 foolproof release, but a single barrel. What this means is, well, all the bourbon in this bottle needs to have come from a single barrel. The advantage of this is a lot of times you'll find really special, unique, outstanding barrels that make really good whiskey that you're going to want to bottle and sell. The downside potentially is some of them could be off profile or a little bit different, or even have some things that are maybe even not desirable potentially in those barrels as well. So those are some things you have to consider with a single barrel. The next thing I talked about is proof. The proof is simply just the alcohol by volume in your bourbon. Like I said, it needs to be in the bottle between 80 proof on the low end, 160 proof on the high end. There's a little confusion around foolproof versus barrel strength or cask strength. There is a slight difference. Foolproof means that this bourbon is distilled and aged in the oak barrels, and then when it's bottled, they're going to use water to dilute that bourbon back to the proof that it originally was when it was coming off the still and into the barrel. So even if the bourbon comes out at 125 proof, but it entered the barrel at 120 proof, they'll dilute that down those 5 proof points to get it back to the entry proof. Whereas something like this Elijah Craig barrel proof, or something that says cask strength, means that regardless of the distillation, the aging, whatever proof that whiskey comes out of the barrel and into the bottle at, they're not diluting it with water. They're typically not filtering or cutting the whiskey in that bottle. It's going right from the barrel to the bottle as is, which is personally my favorite. This is a quick video. I know I threw a lot of things at you. We're gonna build on this as we go. We're starting with the basics. We're gonna see some tastings. We're gonna see some recommendations. We have a lot of really cool stuff to come on the channel. So I do hope that you'll like, comment, subscribe, tell a friend. We're bringing whiskey back to the common man, one awkward kind of video at a time. Really excited about this. Can't wait to see you next time. Have a great day.